Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Caleb Zachrin, editor of the New Books Network. Today I'm speaking with Noel Rubinton about his new book, Looking for a Story, a complete guide to the writings of John McPhee. At 94 years old, McPhee has been transforming journalistic writing for decades. A trailblazer in the medium of creative nonfiction, McPhee covered a multitude of subjects, from life in Alaska to studies of geology. He wrote prodigiously, writing hundreds of articles and 31 books in his career. In Looking for a Story, Noel provides a guide to the life and works of one of the greatest writers in the last 100 years. Noel, thanks for joining me today on the New Books Network.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you.
This is really a fun book for me to get to read because I wasn't really familiar with John McPhee. You know, I think I was more familiar with other writers that he was contemporary with that you might compare him to, like a Tom Wolfe, for example. But McPhee is a really fascinating author. He really is one of those people that he seemed to, just follow his interests and write about all sorts of different things. So, it's really interesting to learn about his career and learn about how he shaped writing and how he's really been one of these people that has really influenced the tidal wave of creative nonfiction that I think is in many ways is just the kind of the expected mode that a lot of people tend to write in now in like literary magazines and the like. So before jumping in and talking about McPhee's life and work, I was wondering if you just tell us a little about yourself and your background.
Sure. I've really been a writer all my life. I think since I was about 7 years old, I knew I wanted to be a newspaper reporter. And I, worked towards that and worked for newspapers in high school, in college, and worked for a newspaper, Newsday, New York, for about 30 years. But I've also wanted to do longer form pieces, which I've done that over the years in magazines, and I wanted to tackle a book. And McPhee is somebody who I started reading when I was 14 years old. So I thought I knew quite a bit about him. And I came up with this idea 4 years ago to write about him. And I quickly learned that I didn't know as much as I thought.
Yeah, I'm curious, for you, reading McPhee, when was this sort of the genesis of the idea for the project? Because I'm sure you had been reading him for years. As he's still alive. He's still I don't know if he's writing anymore, but he's still alive.
Oh, no,
your experience, like just encountering him.
Yeah, he's still going strong. He's still writing, still working on pieces for the New Yorker, working on his next collection for a book. So the idea really just kind of came into my head one day. I've been looking around for a book idea, and this kind of magically came to me. And I think the only thing I could trace it to is that many years ago, one of my other literary heroes was E.B. White. And I got in a huge bibliography that Cornell University, which is where he went to school, did on him. And that sort of sat on my bookshelf for almost 40 years. And somehow that idea kind of much penetrated my brain. And I thought about, well, how about McPhee? How about bringing out his work or a guide to his work? And that was the genesis of it about 4 years ago.
What was the initial process like for you going through his work? Because obviously it's a mountain to tackle it all.
So I don't think I knew how big the mountain was. I knew about his books. I knew that his 30 plus books. There are even more if you count things that he, collaborated with some people on, like a book about Wimbledon. He did with Alfred Eisenstadt, the famous photographer. So I knew about the books. I knew, I knew on paper about the New Yorker articles. I've read many of them as I, got along. But I don't think I realized how much other work there was. And so really it wasn't until I started doing some searches, and then mostly until I started meeting with him, that I realized how much other work he had done in his career, whether it was juvenilia, work he'd done when he was young, or work he'd done as an adult, working for other magazines, writing introductions and forwards for other books. There really is an incredible range of work, much of which has not been seen or hasn't been noticed.
Can you give a little sketch of him as a person? What your sense of his personality is like? Obviously, I imagine that, the 94-year-old McPhee might be different than the 30-year-old McPhee, but what is he like as a person?
He is an unbelievably determined and creative person. His drive is just phenomenal. His imagination, his wanting to do things and get things, worked out. He's just, I don't think he's changed. I mean, his physical energy may not be the same, although he still, works out on a stationary bike. But, was bicycling out on the street until recently, his physical energy may be a little bit different, but his mental energy is really just vast. He keeps a correspondence, I'm sure, with dozens, hundreds of people. He's always looking for ideas. The last time he wrote for the New Yorker in January, that his most recent piece, one of the pieces he did was about Wordle. So this is not really something esoteric. This is something very much in the mainstream. And he just did a wonderful piece about Wordle.
Yeah, I'm looking through the content that he writes about it. It really is his range is just incredible. Um, I'm not sure exactly where to dive in terms of thinking about his work, but let's start maybe with his books, because I think that's probably, obviously he's a magazine writer as well and a journalist. But for his books, he's received an immense amount of acclaim. So for you, are there some books of his that stick out as, either being particularly important, then also maybe books of his that are particularly, ones that you consider to be favorites?
Well, I think what's really amazing about him is that he never does the same thing twice. His fascination, not only with subjects, but with structures. He does every book differently. And so they're still written by the same person, but they're just incredibly different in the kind of the way he does it. I think a classic book of his, one of my favorites, is Encounters with the Archduke, which is a 1971 book, which he did. Really, it's a look at David Brower and how he was one of the leaders of the Sierra Club and really one of the leading environmentalists in his day, and how he went to battle with developers. So McPhee went on trips, 3 different trips with Brower and developers around the country. And so it really was a profile of 4 people. And so it's just a fascinating, beautifully done, study of environmental issues at the time, which I think really holds up well today. On the other hand, he does a lot of books which are more kind of storybooks. Like his first book was about Bill Bradley, the star for Princeton, who later became a star for the Knicks and later was a senator in New Jersey. And that's it's almost like a biography of him, of somebody growing up. And then he'll do a totally different approach. He had another sports book called Levels of the Game, which was a dual biography of Arthur Ashe and Clark Graebner, who was a leading tennis player of the time, not as well known as Arthur Ashe now, told through a one match that they played in the U.S. Open in 1968. And he shows the match and he flashes back to their life, back and forth and back and forth. So there's such variety, even within his books, that I think it's hard to pick a favorite. And I think that, this kind of trite phrase about there's something for everybody, but I think there really is something for people with almost any interest. And that was really one of my goals, was to, even with the books, to make sure that people understood what they were about so they could choose what they wanted to delve into. Because I don't think there are many people who've read every John McPhee book, but there's opportunity there for such enjoyment and such knowledge in reading more.
How would you define his style? What makes his writing approach unique?
Well, he goes deep. As I say, he varies his structure all the time. There's a lot of word playing. There's a lot of he looks to tell a story through the people in their place. He doesn't interview people across the table. He goes out with people and does things with them and then shows them in action. He had a book called The Survival of the Bart Canoe, where a lot of it is told on the water of wild rivers in Maine. And it really is very much of a you are there kind of feeling. Probably his number one selling book coming into the country about Alaska is very much the same. It's very much, he's there. He camped out for weeks with people. People wonder how he could take notes. He said a lot of his notepads got wet in the water.
Did you get an insight into his process? How he approached these stories? Was it, like you said, like he's out there, he's approaching it like a journalist might, or even more so than a journalist. He's living it alongside these subjects. But what's his approach to actually setting down and writing these books? Did you get a sense of is he an early morning writer? Does he write late into the night? Does he write one sentence a day, or is he one of those people that writes 5,000 words at a time?
I think the thing that really sets him apart is his dogged use of structure. And he says that this came from his high school. He went to Princeton High School. He spent almost his entire life in Princeton, New Jersey. And he had a teacher named Olive McKee, who was his English teacher for 3 of the 4 years in high school. And she drilled into her students that they couldn't write anything until they worked out the structure for it. So McPhee builds these incredibly complicated structures even before he writes a word. He does his research, he comes up with his structure, and then he kind of puts things in those boxes. It's almost like they don't write themselves after that. It's still a hard process, but he knows where he's going in a way that I think most writers don't.
Yeah, that's interesting. And for you in this experience going through his work, was there anything about it that, you picked up on or that you thought was just like incredibly unique? Obviously you have experience as a journalist too, but anything that you saw that was in his process that you thought, oh, this is a really unusual, or this is special, this is what sets him apart? Is it a structure approach?
Well, it's his determination and his sticking with structure. And he would, in effect, he would type up all his notes after he did his research. And he did much of his work before there were computers. So you can imagine how tedious that could have been, working at a typewriter just to type up notes. And then he would there's one book, The Headmaster, where he gave his research notes to Deerfield Academy, where he went, and that book is about the headmaster of Deerfield, for a man who was the headmaster for 66 years. And in that, you could see he goes from A, not all the way to Z, but pretty close in terms of different topics. And then he sorts all his notes by those topics. So he's got all these piles of what athletics or whatever, alumni. And then he chooses what he's going to use for that and plugs them into his structure. So really a very disciplined writer. He talks about the pain of writing. I think most writers, at least feel that pain much of the time. But I think what sets him apart is his determination and his discipline.
When when you think about his books, obviously he's received a lot of acclaim. I think he was nominated for the Pulitzer 4 times and won once, Pulitzer General Nonfiction. Can you talk about these books that he was nominated for and then ultimately won for, why you think they were singled out for praise, and whether or not you think that these books are maybe indicative or representative of his actual best work?
Well, the book that he won the Pulitzer Prize for in 1999 was Annals of the Former World, which in effect is the combination of 4 of his books about geology. And this, I think, will probably be seen as his life's work. I mean, he did a lot of other work, but he spent 20 years writing about geology. And it wasn't until always to popular acclaim. I mean, he had readers regularly writing to him saying, stop, no more about these rocks. Enough already, because it was a really tough subject. And he really wanted to do it. He was driven to do it. I think in some way he felt called to do it. And he did it in just a brilliant way. And that's what the Pulitzer Board, finally acknowledged in 99 for that book, which is really, it's like an encyclopedia of geology in the United States. And it's overwhelming, but in his usual style, he tells the stories through people. So you meet geologists in that book where you hear about the people, even if you can't understand some of the words about geology. It certainly sent me my dictionary many times reading that book. But he gets you through the stories of these people. Well, I think that's been true of all his books. And, it's true of the other books where he came in, second or whatever. It's almost random. I mean, I think that so many of his books have been outstanding. He's never been somebody who's like hungered for prizes. He did win the National Book Critics Circle Lifetime Achievement Award, in 2018 for his body of work. But he's just wanted to write. And I think that's what he's always wanted to do ever since he was a kid. I think something I came across, which was pretty amazing, was while I was working with him, a elementary school classmate of his approached him and gave him stories that he wrote when he was a 7-year-old. His elementary school had a quote unquote magazine, and there were these 1-paragraph stories that he wrote. And, it was really John McPhee. He wrote about making a canoe. He wrote about going down to the football field with his father. But he's wanted, ever since he was a very young person, to write, and he's had a lot of the same interests. He talks about that, how most of his books were based on interests that he had before he was 10 years old. And it's true. I mean, some of them were, somebody came out with.
Right. I mean, something that I love about this guide, which I think just shows how comprehensive it is that you talk about the juvenilia in it, and you know, I'm wondering. I mean, 7 years old. That's really juvenilia. That's almost pre-juvenilia in a way. But what did you see in terms of like the development of his writing? Like when did he really start to become a master of the craft?
Well, it definitely started to emerge in college. And he did a profile for the Princeton Tiger, which is a publication that he edited and really transformed, about a man named Spieth, who was a musicologist. And you see the beginnings of his profile star. Some of the columns that he did about, he was the campus correspondent for the Princeton Alumni Weekly for a year. And some of the columns he did had just incredible cleverness to them. So you start to see it. I think, though, the place where it really becomes clear who he is and what he could do is Time magazine, where he worked from 1958 to 1965. And Time magazine at the time was really a training ground for writers. And a lot of the best and brightest of young writers would go to work there. But interestingly, it was an anonymous training ground, because until many years after that, there were no bylines in Time magazine. And because Henry Luce, who was the founder of the magazine, believed that kind of a group journalism idea. And he didn't think you need to have the names. So McPhee, like everybody else, wrote in anonymity. But that's when I think he really can see his mature style developing.
Yeah, for him, he was a magazine writer for his whole life. As you said, he's still doing it. He's writing about Wordle. What is the difference in his approach between his magazine writing versus his book writing? Is it just scale?
I think it really is scale. I think that he loves words. He always reads his work aloud, preferably to somebody else, because he wants to hear the sound of it to see if it, and he does that for anything he writes. He once read all 60,000 words of a book to his editor over the phone over time. And, that's something else that he learned in high school. It's the same woman, Olive McKee, insisted that everybody read whatever they wrote. So he, I think it is scale. I think it's the same. I thought, maybe I could, we could talk a little bit of Time magazine. I could read a couple of examples of work that he did.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've been talking so much about him. I'm sure listeners are chomping at the bit. Like, what does this guy actually sound like? So yeah, I would love to. Yeah.
So Time magazine, I found a way to kind of decode the anonymity through some people helping me in the New York Historical Society Library and the archivist for Time magazine. I found that there were bound volumes of Time magazine where copy editors every week had written in grease pencil the initials of the writer of every story. So if you just had the patience to go through thousands of pages of Time magazine for while John McPhee was there, you could see where all the JMs were. And then I had him to cross-check it with. So I'll just read, a couple of examples. So there's so many. I think one of the things I really was pleased about was the chance to bring this work forward and make it public, in effect, because it's never been attributed to him. So nobody would ever know this is John McPhee. So now there are all these new John McPhee stories. He wrote more than 500 stories for Time magazine. I included about 75 highlights in the book. So I'll read just a couple of them. The first one is from 1964, and it's about Ella Fitzgerald. Her incredible improvising runs are effortless. She could take off from a melody, go over it, around it, through it, under it, moving at twice the speed of 9 to 5 man, tossing in casual doodles through the abstract expressionism of sound. When other singers' jugulars would be bulging, Ella isn't even panting. She seems to breathe through her ears. Her range goes from lower owl to upper sparrow. So within that, I think you see a lot of John McPhee in terms of the way he writes, the idea, the images he comes up with. And now here's something about show business and Broadway. He wrote in the show business section. This is a long piece that he did about the coming season on Broadway in 1963. Every Broadway season looks in prospect like an ingenue in a bridal gown, and in retrospect like a naked iguana. Somehow, the paper promises, the mere names, titles, and themes, are always unbearably alluring. But it is much easier to develop a good idea for a show than to develop a good show. And Broadway never looks better than it does in August, just before it starts down the aisle. And then one last one, which is just a very quick snippet, is about the actor Anthony Quinn. I think, again, this shows his expressiveness. He writes about Quinn. He has a face like a bloodhound that has just eaten an escaped convict. So, I think, again, Time Magazine was really where McPhee started to show who he really was. At the same time, he was all the time trying to get assignments for the New Yorker, pitching them articles, and he was plastering his walls with rejections. We finally broke through with this Bill Bradley profile in 1965, and William Shawn, the legendary editor there, offered him a position as a staff writer, and he resigned from Time Magazine.
Wow. Yeah, I think those snippets that you read are obviously they're extremely expressive, and I think it's very clear how much he's bringing in fiction writing modes into discussing nonfiction, and this was the time when that started to happen, really, in journalism, where journalists began to explore creativity a little bit more. How did he recognize, sort of think about himself as being maybe a part of, this new journalist movement?
I don't think he ever identified with new journalists. He's never been, in his mind, he's never been competing with Tom Wolfe or even Joan Didion. I don't even think Gay Talese. He's really marched to his own drummer. This idea of creative nonfiction is a label that, relatively late in life, he I won't say he embraced it, but he said, that's okay. You can call me that. But new journalism, I don't think was him. He's really an unglitzy person. And I think that, Tom Wolfe in his white suits and Joe Didion, out on in the cafe society were totally different kinds of writers and people. McPhee was really a working man's writer in the sense that all he wanted to do was work. He rarely did interviews. Here's somebody who has never, even to this day, allowed his picture on the jacket of a book. He wanted to be anonymous. He wanted to just write great stories about real people.
Yeah, no, it definitely it seems to track and with his style, and I think that's honestly in many ways like something that I appreciate about him, that he's just so focused on his craft and on his writing, and to a certain extent like the not caring too much. I mean, Tom Wolfe, I love Tom Wolfe, but Tom is definitely kind of a bit of a character in a way that can sometimes distract from his actual writing itself. I find, you're right. The white suit is almost more memorable than anything he ever wrote.
That connects up with something that he said to me one day. I asked him directly about, why no pictures? Having a photo on a jacket, it's just normal. He said, I don't want to get between the reader and my story. And that, I think I think the new journalism probably didn't embrace that idea. They kind of went in a different direction. The journalist often wasn't right.
I'm also curious just to, get a sense from you, because obviously you've talked with him, like, what does he like to read? What are the books for him that can, that he really connects with? Either other journalists that he takes inspiration from or novelists that he really enjoys.
It's actually not something we've talked about a lot. I mean, his library has a lot of books, but I'm sure a lot of them were given to him. I think he really, again, marches to his own drummer. He acquires knowledge in his own way. He reads other people's works, but he's not, I don't think he's really derivative of anyone. He really is an original.
Yeah. No, it's it definitely, obviously I'm sure he reads a lot, but in many ways, I think that tracks with everything that you've said. He's one of these people where obviously he's written a lot, but he's also a journalist, and I feel like sometimes the actual work or research, especially the work of academics that are done, is not going to be as significant as it might be on works of other academics, because they like to write about themselves. But what is the work that's been done on him? Either other thinking, because obviously this book is published by Princeton University Press. So, is there a sort of an opinion or general viewpoint that you've seen that scholars have taken to his work?
Uh, I think most of the writing that I've read about his work has been in two categories. One are people who are interested in rhetoric, who've studied his use of language and his use of structure. And there have been some good analysis of that, whether, you think about this story he did about the search for Marvin Gardens. It's just an incredible piece where he tells the story of Atlantic City through telling the story of monopoly. And, so an academic did a really interesting study of that work. The others are people who look at him in terms of his journalism and assess him that way. But I think you're right that there has not been a lot of, academic discussion of him as literature. And I don't know if my book is going to change that, but I hope that it's going to make it so people find his work to be more accessible, and we can, they'll know what's there and hopefully go for it, including people who may not be McPhee readers yet.
Obviously, there have been tons of reviews written about his books. Are there any particular reviews that stuck out to you as either they get him really right, or they got a particular book right, or maybe you just completely disagreed with what the reviewers say? I'm sure you found a lot of disagreement.
I've read hundreds and hundreds of book reviews of his, and the overwhelming majority of them were extremely favorable. For Coming Into the Country, which was really his breakout book, that was his 13th book. He'd done a lot of work before that, but that's the book that got probably the most attention. I had to work really hard to find a negative review. It was just such a positive view of his book. Actually, the one which I included in the book was, I think, published a year after the book was published. So I think he's had a very favorable press. I think that there have been people who, when he does geology books, there are some people who, quibbled with his focus or exactly how he did it. But generally, I think he's been well appreciated by book reviewers.
Yeah, I'm also curious too about not just the reviews, but also just other impressions that people have done, and like interviews that have been done. What the kind of viewpoint is, maybe of the generation of writers that have come after him, how they think about him, how they've approached him when they talk to him in an interview context.
So Peter Hessler, who was a staff writer for the New Yorker, and ultimately did the foreword for my book, is a wonderful writer, did a terrific interview with John McPhee in the Paris Review in 2010. And that's kind of what caught my attention, and ultimately led me to ask him to do the foreword. And, I think it was a pretty wide-ranging interview. I think something that almost all the interviews have in common is kind of like, how do you do it? It's just trying to understand his method with this idea that, it's replicable. If you learn enough about it, you can be John McPhee too. Which, I think certainly, if you learn enough about it, you can learn how to be a better, more disciplined writer, but you probably won't become a John McPhee. But I think that's really the sense I got of the interviews, that people are trying to figure out what's the magic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you said it's his discipline and structure. I'm curious if you could even elaborate more on just his approach to structure. Like, what is it? Just he creates very detailed outlines, or is it a sort of approach to how he wants the narrative to go that he has in mind? Like, okay, this is where this needs to have a climax, and this is where it is, and this is what I want the reader to be experiencing or feeling while they're reading it.
Well, a couple of things. One is, I think he uses structure as a way to keep himself engaged and entertained. But he'll sometimes come up with a structure almost before he's ready to write the book. That he just wants to do a book this way, and he then see, can I push this into that? So I think it's part of his intellectual, this insatiable desire to keep doing different things. So I think that's one piece of the other. I just think that he kind of works it through in such an elegant way. Every piece of things, and he reworks it. He does draft after draft of pieces that it's not, it always seems fresh and simple. I think really part of his genius is that he makes everything look simple And I think everybody who's read him knows that it's never simple, and that he can do all these things in such a simple looking way just shows the genius behind him.
You mentioned that he once read a 60,000 word draft page. That'd be crazy. 60,000 word draft to his editor over the phone. What was his relationship like with his editors? Because obviously, it seems that he's had, obviously with the exception of his stint at Time, like that he's for the most part been employed, had the same more or less same employer. He's done some other work here and there, and also he's worked with the same publisher. So clearly, they like him enough to keep him around, especially if he didn't even have a breakthrough until his 13th book. So what was his relationship like with his editors?
Well, he's had a lot of editors. I mean, he's outlasted, so many people. His book has in it a list of his editors, both for the New Yorker and for our Scotch Bureau. I thought it would be just a way to show how long he's been around and how many people he's worked with. I think he's always really relied on editors for advice. I mean, he's had his point of view, but he's taken them seriously, and he's wanted to build those relationships. And, he worked sometimes with the same editor for 10 or 15 years. He's worked now with David Remnick, who was a former student of his, for more than 25 years, with Remnick being his editor. So I think it's really a fascinating situation. I know from talking to some of those editors that the editors have learned a lot from McPhee.
Yeah, no, it's I'm curious to learn more about him as a teacher too, because obviously it's something that he's been doing, in some capacity for a really long time. So, what is John McPhee, the teacher, like?
So this was an aspect that I was only very dimly aware of when I wanted to do the book. I knew that he taught at Princeton some course there, but I had no idea what a huge part of his career and his legacy it is. So he taught at Princeton for 50 years, a writing seminar. He's still on the faculty, he still is an advisor, but he's not teaching anymore. And he taught every year, he taught a writing seminar of 16 people. He took applications for it. Sometimes there were 100 people apply, sometimes fewer, and he would choose 16. And they would go through a really rigorous semester with him, not only doing assignments that he worked out with him, but then spending time with him every other week. They spent a half an hour just with him critiquing their latest work and him writing notes in the margins, this marginalia, and these kind of clipped comments. So I think one of the most moving experiences I had doing research was one day a couple of years ago, going to his academic office in Dio Hall, which is a geology building at Princeton, kind of a turreted building. And he's up in a turret. I'd been visiting him in his home, but we went to his office for a particular reason, so I could see his office. And we walked in there, and all you could see were bookshelves all around with hundreds of books. And those were books by his former students. And they had said to him, most of them were described to him. So he has set in motion this incredible, next generation or two of writers who have gone on to write nonfiction books, poetry. Jennifer Weiner, Martin students, is a best-selling novelist. Also magazine editors. Jim Kelly, managing editor of Time magazine. Rick Stengel, managing editor of Time magazine. David Remnick, who's been the editor of the New Yorker for many years. So he has had this profound impact on these writers, who many of whom stay in touch with them regularly. So his legacy as an educator and as a mentor is really huge.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, having hundreds of books by your former students is quite the testament to one's ability as a teacher. It really does sound like he had a profound impact on a lot of people.
That was one of my favorite pieces of research, was to try to figure out exactly how many of his students wrote books. This took a long time. And finally, I documented 125 of his students have written at least one book. There's one person who's written 30 books. And those people are all in the book with their first book cited. So I think
that's unbelievable.
Again, testimony to who he is. And the range of work that they've done just shows, again, what he helped inspire.
I wonder if that's the most from any writing teacher in terms of former students writing novels, or not just novels, but writing books. That truly is even just like looking at the page, which is essentially just an extremely long bibliography is just it's quite overwhelming to go through it. I wonder if he actually had the time to sit down and read them all, but it's really quite remarkable. And clearly also that teach not just his students, but like his work as a writer extended to his children too. Like they wrote a lot as well. So what is what was your sense of what he was like as a father? Was he pushing his kids to also create books as well, or was that just kind of just being around him, he was just an infectious person that you wanted to write a book if you were around him?
Well, his first wife, who he had his 4 daughters with, was a photographer. So it's definitely a creative household. And I think, John McPhee was always a supportive, loving person. It's hard for me to imagine that he ever pushed them to write books. And I just don't think it worked that way. But they saw, the joy that their parents got out of creative endeavors, and they gravitated that way. And all 4 of his daughters are incredibly accomplished, creative people. One of them is a photographer.
Yeah, there's also, as you mentioned in it, for someone that's written so much, he's, for the most part, his ideas have remained in the domain of text. But he does have a credit to his name in terms of a film that was created based on his work. Can you talk about this and what that was like? Because obviously there's only one, so I'm wondering what that story is there.
So there was talk over the years of different books becoming films, and for Levels of the Game, this one that I described earlier about Arthur Ashe and Clark Gravenger's tennis match was optioned several times, but never came to pass. So Ray Stark, who was really a Hollywood legend, read McPhee's story in The New Yorker called Rudoso, and decided that should be a movie. And it turned into a movie, starring Walter Matthau. And it was a kind of drama comedy about a horse, and they're trying to race the horse and win a race in New Mexico. And it was McPhee had nothing to do with the screenplay. Actually, the screenplay was written by the same woman who did Fried Green Tomatoes. It was quite a well-established Hollywood screenplay. And there was a credit at the very end, which, says it was, based on his book. But he kind of, that was the aberration. He still has people coming to him about optioning films, but that's the one that's been made. So it was nice to be able to tell that story.
I look for, I want to see a future, movie about 4-part film about geologists. I think that would, I think that, that's the sort of the question I have for you is what was it about geology that was so interesting to him? Like why rocks? Because in many ways it seems like obviously it's a very important subject because there's a lot we learn a lot about the Earth from geologists, but why was that as a subject so entrancing to him?
Well, he traces it to a geology course that he took at Deerfield when he was a postgraduate year in high school. But it was this interest that was dormant. But he lived in an academic community in Princeton, and he met people in all sorts of fields, including geologists. And it just, over time, kind of got to him. And he decided in typical McPhee fashion that he was going to just do, a short piece about geology. And he went out to do it, and of course, it turned into 20 years. But it embodies so much about history, and kind of, it was just a great canvas for him. But I think it was also a chance for him to really learn. And I think one of the things that separates him is that he continues to want to learn about new things. Some writers want to keep doing the same thing over and over. They get tired. He never gets tired. And geology was just, it was like he didn't get a PhD, but he got plenty of awards from geologists, who were PhDs.
Yeah, he does seem like this interesting person where, like you said, he's the working man's journalist in many ways, but he's also, this highly intellectual person who spends time with scholars of all sorts of different subjects. He really seems like this type of person who's just able to, be in so many different circles. As far as like his personality is concerned, is he? Sometimes people say, writers are sort of introverts, but he's obviously going out and spending time, with his his subjects. Is he a slightly more extroverted person than the typical writer?
I don't think so. He's a very private person, and he's not. I think I never asked him whether he's identified as an introvert or an extrovert, but I would say he's pretty introverted, but he's got a great style of making people feel comfortable and all sorts of different people. And so I think that's a gift that any kind of writer and reporter needs if they're going to get stories from people, is they need to make people feel comfortable. And McPhee had that, still has it. And, he just makes people want to tell them things, want to tell him things.
For listeners, if there is a place that you think they should start, either a great profile that he's written or a book that you think is a great starting place, where would you point them to?
Oh, that's hard.
You don't have to. You don't have to mention one.
So I think that certainly Encounters of the Arch Druid, as I mentioned, Looking for a Ship, which I kind of bent for the title of the book, is a wonderful book about the merchant marine and on a trip in South America. Some of his, I think if you haven't read Coming Into the Country, it's just a beautiful book about Alaska and wilderness. So many things to learn. For writers, Draft Number 4 is a book that he did, which is in effect his guide to writing, which is just beautifully done with a lot of great ideas. Sports, the Bill Bradley, the Levels of the Game. Care about oranges? You can read about oranges. So it's just kind of an endless buffet. And I think I hope that giving a good summary of the books at the beginning will give people a chance to find their entrance point. Because I think that McPhee has written so much that you can be overwhelmed by it. It's hard to know where to start. And my advice to people is just to start, because you're gonna want to read more.
Having done this project, I'm curious for you if there's anything, when you go and sit at the computer or the typewriter or the blank page and start writing, if there's anything that you find yourself doing differently or thinking about now that you've really immersed yourself in the mind and the works of John.
So I've been thinking about this for a while, since I've been reading him for a while. And I think the two things are structure. He definitely continues to, his example impresses on me the importance of knowing what your structure is to be and what your goal is. And the other is to really, just to try to, it's to see how much you can get from people that's not just kind of a canned speech. And I think that, one of the things he does so effectively is he gets people out of their, out of an unnatural environment into a natural environment. And so that's something which I've done in my life as a writer, but I probably could do more. And because you get people, it's kind of like people talk about when they have kids growing up, that one of the best places to talk to them is in a car when you're driving and you're not looking at your kid, and your kid is in the back seat. I think that's true for writers, that if you can get people, when you're sitting with somebody, particularly if you sit with somebody with a tape recorder going, it becomes unnatural. And I think that McPhee really showed, what you can get if you get out there with people.
Yeah. His career is really fascinating, and it seems like he really is just in many ways like the archetype of the writer who just uses the written word as a vehicle to explore all aspects of life, and I think like his sense and his style really just comes alive. His appreciation and his just kind of voracious hunger to read the world is remarkable. And I think that this guide is really helpful. And I do think that that scholars, either English professors or people in literary studies or in creative writing departments, could really gain a lot from this book. Like I could easily imagine a course that's sort of taught on the works of John McPhee using this book as a guide. So I really do think that it helps provide this really wonderful entry point into his ideas, because as you say, it's this extremely overwhelming, because he wrote a lifetime's amount of work, and he's still going. So that's just unbelievable.
Wow, thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, Noel, it's been really wonderful to have you on and to talk about the life and works of John McPhee, and I really do recommend that people go and pick up the book. It's called Looking for a Story, A Complete Guide to the Writings of John McPhee. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.